June 18th, 1945, early afternoon, a coral ridge on the southern tip of Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding general of the United States 10th Army, is standing at a forward observation post watching Marines go into battle. He has been on this island for 79 days. He has commanded the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the Pacific War. He has buried thousands of his men in the red mud below these ridges. And the battle is almost over. The Japanese 32nd Army has been compressed into a pocket barely 3 miles wide. Organized resistance will collapse within days. Victory is so close that Buckner can taste it. He is here to watch the 8th Marine Regiment, fresh from reserve, attack toward a village called Mezzato near the southwest coast. Colonel Clarence Wallace, the regimental commander, is briefing him on the progress of the assault. Buckner is a conspicuous figure. He always has been. He wears a helmet with 3 stars painted on it. He rides in a jeep flying a 3-star general's flag. He has a habit of visiting the front lines during active combat, standing upright where other men would crouch, watching the battle as if studying a chess problem from across the board. A Marine outpost on the far side of the ridge has already signaled that the Japanese can clearly see his rank insignia from their positions. Someone hands him an unmarked helmet. He puts it on. It does not matter. Shortly after 1300 hours, a Japanese shell strikes a coral outcropping 6 feet from where Buckner is standing. The exact caliber of the weapon has never been conclusively determined. The official Army history describes it as a Japanese dual-purpose gun. Many secondary accounts estimate it was a 47mm anti-tank gun, but the truth is that no one is certain. What every account agrees on is the cruel mechanism of death. The shell did not kill him directly. It struck the coral rock, and a jagged fragment of coral, not metal shrapnel but coral, was driven through his chest. He collapsed immediately. Colonel Wallace, standing beside him, was untouched. His executive officer, Major William Chamberlain, also standing beside the general, was unharmed. The general and the 2 officers had been standing within feet of each other. Only one was hit. Marines wrestled the wounded general onto a poncho and started carrying him downhill toward an aid station. According to the most reliable accounts, he asked if anyone else had been hurt. Then he stopped speaking. There is no well-authenticated dramatic final statement. Some popular accounts have attributed dramatic last words to Buckner, but these appear to be confusions with other historical figures. The strongest sourced detail is simply that he asked about his men and then fell silent. 10 minutes later, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was dead. He was 58 years old. He became the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the entire Second World War. He would hold that distinction for more than half a century, until Lieutenant General Timothy Maud was killed in the attack on the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. The irony was immediate and savage. Buckner had survived the entire 82-day campaign. He was killed by some of the last shells fired on Okinawa, with victory days away. 3 other lieutenant generals died during the war: Leslie McNair, Frank Maxwell Andrews, and Millard Harmon, but their deaths came from friendly fire, an air crash, and a plane disappearance respectively. Buckner was the only one killed by the enemy. The very next day, June 19th, Brigadier General Claudius Easley, assistant commander of the 96th Infantry Division, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire while pointing out an enemy position at the front. 2 American generals dead in 2 days, in the final hours of a battle that was already decided. And in the hour that followed Buckner's death, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the United States military. Something that has never happened since. A United States Marine took command of a United States Army field army. His name was Roy Geiger. He was 60 years old. He was a Marine aviator, a ground combat commander, and as of this afternoon, the man sitting in a chair that the entire United States Army believed no Marine should ever be allowed to occupy. The question that would consume Washington, Manila, and Honolulu over the next 5 days was not how to finish the battle. The battle was already won. The question was how to get this Marine out of that chair before anyone had time to think about what it meant that he was sitting in it. This was not a simple matter of military protocol. This was an institutional crisis. Because by the summer of 1945, the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps were locked in a rivalry so bitter, so deeply personal, and so consequential for the future of both services that the question of who commanded whom had become the most dangerous question in the American military. Not dangerous in the way that a Japanese shell was dangerous. Dangerous in the way that an idea is dangerous. The idea that the walls between institutions are not built on necessity but on fear. The fear that someone from outside the institution can do the job just as well as someone from inside it. To understand why a Marine commanding an Army field army was not merely unusual but explosive, you have to go back 1 year, to another island, and to a confrontation between two men with the same last name who represented everything that was wrong with how America organized its military. The invasion of Saipan in June of 1944 was commanded by Marine Lieutenant General Holland McTire Smith, known throughout the Pacific as Howlin' Mad Smith. Holland Smith was aggressive, profane, impatient, and utterly convinced that Marine infantry was superior to Army infantry in every measurable way. He said it openly. He said it to reporters. He said it in the presence of Army officers who outranked him. Under his command on Saipan were 2 Marine divisions, the 2nd and the 4th, and 1 Army division, the 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Army Major General Ralph Corbin Smith. No relation. 2 different Smiths, 2 different services, 1 island. The combination was a disaster waiting to happen. The battle went badly for the 27th Division. Its advance lagged behind the Marine divisions on either flank, opening a dangerous gap in the American line that the Japanese exploited with a counterattack. Holland Smith, furious at what he considered inexcusable Army slowness, made a decision that would echo through the rest of the war and beyond. On June 24, 1944, he relieved Ralph Smith of command of the 27th Division in the middle of the battle. A Marine general had fired an Army general during active combat. It was the only time it happened in the entire Pacific War, and the institutional explosion that followed nearly destroyed inter-service cooperation. The Army viewed the firing as a deliberate insult to their entire branch. Ralph Smith's defenders argued that the 27th Division had faced the most difficult terrain on the island, that Holland Smith's expectations were unrealistic, that his understanding of Army infantry tactics was shallow, and that he had made the relief as a grandstanding act designed to humiliate the Army and elevate the Marines in the public eye. Army Lieutenant General Robert Richardson, the senior Army commander in the Central Pacific, who had long campaigned against Marines holding command authority over Army troops, flew to Saipan and personally decorated members of the 27th Division in a ceremony that was widely understood as a public rebuke of Holland Smith. The gesture provoked a sharp backlash from Nimitz and his subordinate commanders, who viewed it as a deliberate challenge to Navy authority in the theatre. Richardson then convened a board of inquiry to investigate the relief. The board was chaired, with an irony that no novelist would dare invent, by none other than Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. The board found the relief unjustified, though its findings had no formal binding power. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, wrote to Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, that relations between the services had, in Marshall's own words, deteriorated beyond mere healthy rivalry. Ralph Smith himself went further. He formally recommended that no Army combat troops should ever again be permitted to serve under Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith. The Saipan affair drew the battle lines for everything that followed. It was not just a disagreement between 2 generals. It became a proxy war for the larger institutional question. Richardson used the episode to escalate a campaign he had been waging for months. He had already argued in writing that no Marine officer above the rank of colonel should ever exercise command over Army troops. He had lobbied Marshall and the War Department to strip the Marine Corps of its expeditionary combat role entirely, reducing it to the kind of small, ceremonial force the British Royal Marines had become. Richardson believed, and said openly, that the Army was the only service qualified to conduct large-scale ground operations, and that the Marine Corps was a duplicative, expensive anomaly, sustained by public relations rather than military necessity. The Marine Corps knew all of this, and Marine leadership understood something that many of their junior officers did not. The real threat to the Corps was not on the battlefield. It was in Washington. The Army's plans for the post-war military, laid out in classified Joint Chiefs of Staff documents, included reducing the Marine Corps to a force of roughly 60,000 men, with no divisions, no aviation, and no mission beyond ship detachments and embassy security. Every major command decision in the Pacific, from Saipan onward, was shaped by the Marines' awareness that they were fighting for institutional survival as much as military victory. And its most direct consequence was felt on Okinawa. When the Navy began planning the invasion of that island in late 1944, Admirals Spruance and Turner wanted Holland Smith to command the ground forces. Nimitz overruled them. After Saipan, the Army would never accept Holland Smith in command of their divisions again. The political cost was too high. The command went instead to an Army officer who was known for his ability to work across service lines, and who had, somewhat remarkably for the time, genuine respect among Marine officers. It went to Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., the same man who had chaired the Board of Inquiry that condemned Holland Smith's decision, the conciliator, the diplomat in uniform. And Buckner, before the first shot was fired on Okinawa, made the decision that would change the course of Marine Corps history. He designated Marine Major General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, as his successor in the event of his death. Buckner chose Geiger over the senior Army officer on the island. He did it deliberately. He did it because he knew Geiger's combat record, trusted his judgment under fire, and believed he was simply the best available man for the job regardless of the uniform he wore. It was perhaps the most genuinely joint command decision any American general made in the entire Second World War. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. carried one of the most storied names in American military history. He was born on July 18th, 1886, in Munfordville, Kentucky, the only son of Confederate Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr. The elder Buckner was the general who had surrendered Fort Donelson to Ulysses Grant in February of 1862, in one of the first major Union victories of the Civil War. After the war, the elder Buckner rebuilt his life, served as governor of Kentucky, and ran for vice president on the Gold Democrat ticket in 1896. He was 63 years old when his only son was born, the child of a late marriage to Delia Hayes Claiborne of Richmond, Virginia. Young Buckner attended the Virginia Military Institute, then secured an appointment to West Point through President Theodore Roosevelt, a request his Confederate father made directly to the president. He graduated in 1908. His early career was competent but unremarkable. He served in the Philippines, taught at West Point as commandant of cadets, and spent decades in the standard progression of Army schools and garrison posts. His moment of prominence came in August of 1940, when he received command of the Alaska Defense Command at Fort Richardson near Anchorage. He spent 4 years in the territory, building airfields and fortifications across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, and directing American and Canadian forces during the Aleutian Islands campaign, when the Japanese seized the islands of Attu and Kiska in June of 1942, the only invasion and occupation of North American soil by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. Under his command, American forces fought the brutal Battle of Attu in May of 1943, a 19-day engagement in Arctic conditions, fog, and tundra that produced some of the highest casualty rates per combatant of any battle in the Pacific. Of a Japanese garrison of roughly 2,900 men, only 28 survived. About 550 Americans were killed in action, over 1,100 were wounded, and roughly 2,000 more were evacuated with severe cold injuries and disease. The subsequent landing on Kiska in August found the island already secretly evacuated by the Japanese, an intelligence failure that was deeply embarrassing to the command. Buckner was a ruddy-faced, white-haired apostle of the vigorous physical life. He was a robust outdoorsman who seemed more at ease on a glacier than in a staff meeting. He drove his staff on forced marches through the Alaskan wilderness and led by personal example in conditions that would have broken most men his age. He was popular with his troops and competent as an organizer, but he had limited amphibious experience and a fundamentally conservative tactical temperament, traits that would define his conduct of the Okinawa campaign, and that his critics, both during and after the battle, would never let him forget. To understand why Buckner trusted Roy Geiger with his army, you have to understand who Roy Geiger was, and the answer begins not on a battlefield, but on a farm in northeast Florida. Roy Stanley Geiger was born on January 25, 1885, in Middleburg, Florida, a small town in Clay County, about 30 miles south of Jacksonville. He was the sixth of 7 children in a farming family. He attended Florida State Normal School, then earned a law degree from Stetson University in 1907, He could have practiced law. He could have built a quiet civilian career. Instead, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a private on November 2, 1907, in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was commissioned a second lieutenant on February 5, 1909. His early career was the kind of expeditionary service that defined the old Marine Corps. He served aboard the battleships Wisconsin and Delaware. He fought in Nicaragua in 1912 at the assault on Coyotepe and Barranca Hills. He served in the Philippines and at the American legation in Peking from 1913 to 1916. He was, by every conventional measure, a career Marine infantry officer on an unremarkable path. Then, in March of 1916, he did something that changed everything. He reported to the Naval Aeronautics Station at Pensacola, Florida, as a student aviator. He was 31 years old, ancient by the standards of flight training then and now. Flying did not come naturally to him. A widely told story about Geiger's training captures the essence of the man. Geiger took a full year to learn to fly. His instructor tried every approach. Nothing worked. Finally, out of frustration or desperation, or possibly just curiosity, the instructor sent Geiger up solo to see what would happen. Geiger took off, flew around the field, and made what was described as the prettiest landing anyone had ever seen. The conclusion drawn by those who knew him was that all Geiger needed was enough responsibility to make him try. That observation would prove to be the most accurate description anyone ever gave of Roy Geiger's character. Give him responsibility, and he performed. Withhold it, and he waited. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He earned his wings in June of 1917, designated Naval Aviator number 49, the 5th Marine Corps aviator in history. Only 4 Marines had learned to fly before Roy Geiger. The Marine Corps aviation community in 1917 was not an organization. It was a handful of men with wings and a conviction that the airplane would change warfare. Geiger was one of the men who proved them right. In the First World War, he arrived in France in July of 1918, served with No. 5 Group of the Royal Air Force at Dunkirk, and commanded a squadron of the 1st Marine Aviation Force attached to the Northern Bombing Group. He led bombing raids against German supply lines and military targets in occupied Belgium and earned the Navy Cross. Between the wars, Geiger built the most extraordinary professional resume of any officer in the American military. He flew combat support missions in Haiti. He graduated from the Army Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth in 1925. He served as officer in charge of Marine Corps aviation from 1931 to 1935, helping shape the close air support doctrine that would become the Marine Corps' signature contribution to modern warfare. He attended the Army War College. He attended the Naval War College. He served as a United States military observer with British forces in the Western Desert in the spring of 1941, during the opening months of Rommel's First Africa Corps offensive. No other senior American commander had attended the war colleges of all 3 services. No other had held major command of both aircraft and ground combat forces. And no other had observed a foreign enemy's armored operations firsthand before the United States even entered the war. Geiger had done all of it, across 35 years. When the war came to the Pacific, it came first to Guadalcanal, and Geiger came with it. In September of 1942, at the age of 57, he took command of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing on Henderson Field during the most desperate phase of the campaign. The air group was known as the Cactus Air Force, named for Guadalcanal's radio call sign. It was fighting for its life against Japanese air and naval forces that outnumbered it in every category. Pilots were flying with malaria. Ground crews were cannibalizing wrecked aircraft for spare parts. The runway was cratered by Japanese naval gunfire every night and repaired with crushed coral every morning. Japanese bombers came overhead so regularly that the Marines could set their watches by the raids. The situation in October of 1942 was genuinely desperate. The Japanese sent the battleships Congo and Haruna to bombard Henderson Field on the night of October 13th. For over an hour, the 2 battleships fired more than 900 rounds of 14-inch shells into the airfield, destroying 48 of the 90 planes on the strip and cratering the runway so badly that it was briefly unusable. Geiger's response was characteristic. He rounded up the surviving aircraft, got the runway patched, and had planes in the air by dawn. When fuel ran low, His crews reportedly drained aviation gasoline from wrecked bombers and strained it through cloth to filter out debris. When bombs ran short, pilots improvised with whatever ordnance was available. He made do with what he had, exactly the way 30 years of Marine Corps expeditionary service had taught him, where you never had enough of anything, and you figured it out anyway. Geiger did not manage this crisis from a rear headquarters. He flew combat missions himself, a 57-year-old general climbing into the cockpit and going up to fight alongside men half his age. He earned a Gold Star in lieu of a second Navy Cross for his conduct during those months. When he finally left Guadalcanal, the Cactus Air Force had helped break the back of Japanese air power in the Solomons. After Guadalcanal, Geiger took command of the 1st Amphibious Corps, later redesignated the 3rd Amphibious Corps. He led the initial landings at Bougainville in November of 1943, where he commanded both Marine and Army divisions in a contested beachhead under daily Japanese air attack. The Bougainville operation was significant because it was one of the first Pacific campaigns in which Marine and Army divisions fought side by side under a single Marine commander, and Geiger's handling of the inter-service dynamics drew praise from Army officers who had expected friction and found cooperation instead. He commanded the recapture of Guam in July and August of 1944, an operation that carried deep significance because Guam had been American territory seized by Japan in the opening days of the war. The island had been in Japanese hands for 2.5 years. Geiger went ashore personally on the second day and established his command post under fire. The fighting on Guam was fierce, particularly around the Orote Peninsula and the jungle hills near Mount Barrigada, but Geiger's force secured the island in 20 days. He then commanded the assault on Peleliu in September and October of 1944, one of the most bitterly contested island battles of the entire war. Peleliu was supposed to fall in 4 days. It took over 2 months. The 1st Marine Division, fighting in temperatures that reached 115 degrees, suffered over 6,500 casualties, more than a third of the division's strength. Before being relieved by the Army's 81st Infantry Division, Geiger managed the transition between Marine and Army forces on Peleliu with the same inter-service skill he had shown on every previous operation. At every level, in every campaign, he commanded soldiers and Marines together with a cooperative style that drew praise from officers of both branches. His nickname was Rugged Roy. Time magazine described him in October of 1944 as thick-set, poker-faced, and chill-eyed, a Marine's Marine. Holland Smith, who was himself the most divisive Marine general of the war, paid Geiger the compliment that mattered most. He reportedly said that no military aviator since the Wright brothers had ever exercised, quite so interchangeably, such major air and ground commands, all in one war. That assessment has never been seriously challenged. No American officer before or since has compiled a comparable record of dual competence. This was the man Buckner trusted with his army. This was the man the army was determined to replace the moment he assumed command. But before we reach the 5 days that shook the institutional foundations of the American military, we need to understand what the 10th Army had been through on Okinawa. Because the battle that killed Buckner and elevated Geiger was not a routine campaign, it was the bloodiest engagement of the entire Pacific War, and its carnage would shape the decision to use the atomic bomb. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, was the last great battle of the Second World War. The island lay just 340 miles south of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's home islands. It was intended as the staging base for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Everything about the operation was enormous. The 10th Army was a genuinely unique cross-service force. It included Major General John Hodge's 24th Corps, comprising 4 Army infantry divisions, the 7th, the 27th, the 77th, and the 96th. It included Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps, comprising 3 Marine divisions, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 6th. At full strength, the 10th Army fielded over 182,000 men. The supporting fleet numbered some 1,600 vessels, including 18 battleships, 27 cruisers, 177 destroyers and destroyer escorts, and 39 aircraft carriers. Opposing them was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army, roughly 100,000 strong, including regulars, naval infantry, and conscripted Okinawan civilians. Ushijima was a quiet, thoughtful career officer who had served as commandant of the Japanese military academy. He was respected by his peers for his calm judgment and his willingness to listen to subordinates, a rare trait in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army. Ushijima's defense plan was conceived by his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, and it represented a fundamental break from previous Japanese strategy in the Pacific. On Iwo Jima, on Peleliu, on Saipan, the Japanese had contested the beaches and been destroyed piecemeal by overwhelming American naval firepower before the ground troops could even get into the fight. Yahara studied those failures methodically. He concluded that every beach defense in the Pacific had failed because American naval guns could reach the beach positions and because the Japanese commanders wasted their strength in suicidal banzai charges that accomplished nothing but the annihilation of their own reserves. Yahara proposed something different. Do not contest the beaches. Let the Americans land unopposed. Concede the airfields. Concede the north. Draw them south into the rugged highlands around the ancient fortress of Shuri Castle, where every ridge and every cave becomes a killing ground, where naval guns cannot reach the reverse slopes, and where American material superiority is neutralized by the terrain itself. Bleed them until the cost of going forward becomes unbearable. Ushijima's aggressive deputy, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, bitterly opposed the plan. Cho was a firebrand, a man who believed in the attack as both a military and a spiritual necessity. He argued for meeting the Americans on the beaches, for launching counterattacks, for dying gloriously rather than waiting underground. The tension between Cho's aggression and Yahara's calculation ran through the Japanese command for the entire campaign. In the critical early weeks, Ushijima sided with Yahara, and the strategy worked with devastating effectiveness. When Cho finally persuaded Ushijima to launch a major counterattack in early May, committing the army's last reserves to an offensive that gained nothing and cost thousands of irreplaceable troops, Yahara was vindicated, and the Japanese defense began its final disintegration. L-Day was April 1st, 1945. It was simultaneously Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day. The landings on the Hagushi beaches were astonishingly unopposed. American troops walked ashore against almost no resistance and captured the Kadena and Yomitan airfields within hours. The ease of the landing stunned the American command. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner signaled Nimitz that he might be crazy, but it looked like the Japanese had quit the war. Nimitz sent back a reply that would become one of the famous signals of the war. Delete all after crazy. The 6th Marine Division swept north and reached Hido Point, the island's northern tip, by April 13th. The campaign appeared to be a walkover. American confidence was high. Casualties were light. The Japanese, it seemed, had made a colossal miscalculation by not defending the beaches. Then the Americans turned south and met the Shuri Line, and the war on Okinawa became something none of them had ever imagined. The Shuri Line was a defensive network, unlike anything the Americans had encountered in 3 years of Pacific fighting. It was anchored on a series of coral and limestone ridges and escarpments that the Japanese had fortified for months with tunnels, concrete emplacements, and interlocking fields of fire. The terrain was a natural fortress. Every ridge concealed the next. Every cave connected to a network of passages that allowed the Japanese to retreat, reinforce, and counterattack through underground corridors invisible from the surface. American units would capture a hilltop, believing it clear, and be attacked from beneath their own feet by Japanese soldiers emerging from tunnels behind them. The names of these positions would become markers for individual catastrophes. Kakazu Ridge, Conical Hill, the Maeda Escarpment, later known as Hacksaw Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop, Half Moon, Horseshoe. At Kakazu Ridge on April 9th, the 96th Infantry Division attacked what appeared to be a moderately defended position and was thrown back with heavy casualties. The Japanese had honeycombed the ridge with interconnected tunnels and fighting positions that could only be reduced one by one with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and point-blank tank fire. Each position had to be taken individually, cleared individually, and held individually against counterattacks that came through the tunnels from directions the Americans could not predict. The pattern repeated itself at every major position on the Shuri Line. American firepower, the most devastating concentration of artillery and naval gunfire ever assembled in the Pacific, could suppress the surface but could not reach the underground networks. The Japanese waited out the bombardments in their tunnels, then emerged to fight the moment the infantry advanced. The 24th Corps slammed into the outer Shuri defences on April 19th. In the first 4 days alone, the Corps suffered thousands of casualties trying to break through. Buckner massed what may have been the heaviest firepower concentration of the Pacific War, multiple battleships, cruisers, and destroyers combined with hundreds of aircraft and dozens of battalions of field artillery against a 5-mile front. It failed to crack the Japanese defences. Then came the rains. By early May, the monsoon turned Okinawa into a nightmare landscape of flooded roads, mired vehicles, and decomposing bodies half buried in mud. The battlefield came to resemble the worst photographs of the Western Front in the First World War. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, remains the most unflinching infantry account of the Pacific War, described the horror in a chapter he titled, Of Mud and Maggots. Sledge wrote that they were in the depths of the abyss, the ultimate horror of war. He said he believed they had been flung into the cesspool of hell. Offshore, the Navy was enduring its own catastrophe. Between April 6th and June 22nd, the Japanese launched 10 waves of massed kamikaze attacks called kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. The first wave, Kikusui No. 1, on April 6th, sent 355 suicide aircraft against the fleet in a single day. The following day, the super battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, with 9 18-inch guns and armour nearly 1.5 feet thick, sortied from Japan on April 6th on a one-way suicide mission carrying barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa. On April 7th, she was intercepted by nearly 400 American carrier aircraft and sunk in a 2-hour attack that killed over 3,000 of her crew. The sinking of the Yamato marked the definitive end of the battleship era. The pillar of smoke from her explosion was visible for 100 miles. Over the following weeks, the kamikazes continued to hammer the fleet in 9 more massed waves. Destroyers posted on radar picket stations around the island bore the worst of it. These ships were the fleet's early warning system, stationed alone or in pairs at the outer ring of the defensive perimeter, and the kamikazes hit them first. The crews of the picket destroyers endured a sustained nightmare that had no equivalent in any previous naval war. They could see the planes coming on radar, track them closing, watch them dive, and do nothing except fire their guns and pray. Some destroyers were hit multiple times and kept fighting. Others were sunk outright. The psychological strain was enormous. Sailors on the picket stations developed a grim fatalism that Navy psychiatrists later documented as one of the most concentrated combat stress syndromes of the entire war. Admiral Nimitz told Buckner bluntly that the Navy was losing roughly 1.5 ships per day and that the fleet could not sustain the losses indefinitely. The pressure on Buckner to break through the Shuri line was enormous and came from every direction, from the Navy, from the Marine Corps, and from Washington. This pressure is what makes the great tactical controversy of Okinawa so charged. The Marine generals urged Buckner repeatedly to break the Shuri deadlock with a second amphibious landing behind Japanese lines. Land the 2nd Marine Division, which had served as the 10th Army's floating reserve, and conducted a demonstration off the southeast coast on L-Day before withdrawing to Saipan. On the southeast coast at the Minatoga beaches, turn the Japanese right flank, force Ushijima to fight in 2 directions at once. Army Major General Andrew Bruce of the 77th Infantry Division pressed the same recommendation independently. Even the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Alexander Vandergrift, visited Okinawa in mid-April and seconded the proposal in person. Buckner rejected it every time. His logistics staff told him the southern beaches could be supplied with food but not ammunition. His intelligence officers predicted stiff resistance at any landing site. Buckner had studied the Anzio landings in Italy, where an amphibious force had been pinned on a narrow beachhead for 4 agonizing months, and he compared the Okinawa proposal to another Anzio, only worse. He believed the Shuri line would crack under the sustained weight of his combined firepower and manpower. Nimitz and his chief of staff, Forrest Sherman, agreed with Buckner. Admiral Spruance, who privately admitted he wished for some of Holland Smith's drive, did not. The Marines did not. Admiral Turner did not. Historians remain genuinely divided on whether Buckner was right or wrong. After early May, when Cho persuaded Ushijima to commit the Japanese reserves to a massive counterattack that failed disastrously, a southern landing might have trapped the remnants of the 32nd Army between 2 American forces and shortened the campaign by weeks. But the terrain behind the Minnetonka beaches was as forbidding as anything on the Shuri line. The logistical concerns were real, and a botched landing could have produced a catastrophe worse than the frontal grind it was meant to replace. What is not debatable is the cost of the strategy Buckner chose. The frontal assault ground forward at roughly a mile a day through some of the worst fighting conditions American soldiers and Marines had ever faced. Every yard was paid for in blood. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the stories of these men visible a little longer. It means more than you know. The human cost of Okinawa produced acts of individual courage that stand among the most extraordinary in American military history. 24 men received the Medal of Honor for actions during the 3-month battle. Many of the awards were posthumous. The most famous was Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector serving as a combat medic with the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. At the Maida Escarpment, the 400-foot cliff the troops called Hacksaw Ridge, Doss refused to carry a weapon into combat. Between April 29th and May 21st, he repeatedly exposed himself to fire to rescue wounded men. After his company gained the summit and was thrown back by a Japanese counterattack that inflicted approximately 75 casualties, Doss remained alone in the fire-swept area. He carried the wounded one by one to the edge of the cliff and lowered them on a rope-supported litter down the face of the escarpment to friendly hands below. He was wounded 4 times during the campaign. He used a rifle stock to splint his own shattered arm. He refused evacuation until other wounded men had been treated first. President Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945. He was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military decoration. At Sugarloaf Hill, the 6th Marine Division fought the most concentrated small-unit battle of the Pacific War. The hill was barely 75 feet high and 300 yards long, a pimple of ground that looked insignificant until you understood that it was held by an entire Japanese regiment with interlocking fire from the flanking positions of Half Moon and Horseshoe. The hill was taken and retaken 11 times in 11 days of fighting. The casualties among the Marine units committed to Sugarloaf were devastating. Some battalions lost more than half their strength. The fighting there produced some of the highest casualty rates in the Pacific War. Major Henry Alexius Courtney, Jr., executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Marines, found himself stranded on the slopes of Sugarloaf on the night of May 14th with a small force of Marines. They could not retreat across the open ground below without being annihilated. They could not stay where they were and survive until morning. Courtney made a decision. He told his men he was going up that hill. He gathered about 50 volunteers and led them to the crest in a night assault, hurling grenades into Japanese cave positions as they climbed. They reached the top. Courtney was killed instantly by a mortar burst. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. A Marine base on Okinawa, Camp Courtney, bears his name today. Also at Sugarloaf was Corporal James Day, who held an exposed position on the hill for 3 days with a handful of Marines, fighting off repeated Japanese counterattacks at close range, sometimes with bayonets and entrenching tools. Day survived the battle but did not receive the Medal of Honor until 1998, more than 50 years later, when President Clinton presented it at the White House. And on the small island of Ii-Shima, just northwest of Okinawa, the war's most beloved correspondent had already fallen. Ernie Pyle, the man who had told America what its sons were enduring in foxholes from North Africa to Normandy, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on April 18th, 1945, while traveling with the 77th Infantry Division. He never saw Geiger take command of the 10th Army. He had been dead exactly 2 months. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in any branch, in any theater, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit? What island? What did they carry home with them? Those details are the actual record of this war. They deserve to be preserved by the people who still carry them. Now we return to the Coral Ridge, June 18th, early afternoon. When Buckner fell, word reached Geiger within the hour. By late afternoon, Roy Geiger had formally assumed command of the United States 10th Army. A Marine was now commanding 4 Army infantry divisions, 3 Marine divisions, a tactical air force, and every supporting unit on an island where the battle was entering its final bloody days. He was promoted to lieutenant general shortly after assuming command. The promotion was not a reward. It was a formality required because a 2-star general could not hold command of an organization previously led by a 3-star. The army was not honoring Geiger. It was counting the hours until it could replace him. The institutional reaction came not from Okinawa, where the men in the foxholes did not particularly care which branch their commanding general belonged to, but from the rear echelons, from MacArthur's headquarters in Manila, from Marshall's office in Washington, from Nimitz's staff in Honolulu. General Douglas MacArthur, recently named Supreme Commander of United States Army Forces in the Pacific, viewed any Marine in command of Army divisions as an institutional threat. He had viewed Buckner's cooperation with the Navy and Marines with open suspicion, seeing it as a betrayal of Army interests. A Marine commanding an Army field army was, in MacArthur's framework, an affront to the fundamental principle that the Army commanded its own forces. General Marshall understood the precedent clearly. If a Marine could command a field army on Okinawa, a Marine could command a field army in the invasion of Japan, and that was something the Army could not permit under any circumstances. Joseph Stilwell was the instrument they chose. Vinegar Joe, the acid-tongued general who had spent most of the war in the China-Burma-India theater, had been recalled from China after his relationship with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek collapsed. He was in Honolulu when Buckner was killed. He had long coveted an army command. He received his orders almost immediately. Stilwell's private diary, published after his death, reveals a man who had little regard for either Buckner or the Marines. He dismissed Buckner as a Pollyanna. He described the inter-service cooperation on Okinawa as nauseating. He viewed Buckner's designation of Geiger as successor as proof that Buckner had been captured by the Navy and Marines. He referred to the entire command arrangement with something approaching personal disgust. The contempt was institutional and personal simultaneously. Geiger used his 5 days the way he had used every command he had ever held. He finished the job. There was no need to radically alter the tactical approach. The battle was won. The 32nd Army was reduced to final pockets of resistance. But Geiger's command was not purely ceremonial. He directed the final operations that compressed the remaining Japanese defenders into their last positions around Hill 89 and the cliffs at Mabuni. He coordinated the integration of the 2nd Marine Division's regiments into the final push. He managed the transition of supply and evacuation operations from combat footing to occupation mode. And he did something that is easy to overlook but that every commander on the island noticed. He continued the style of inter-service cooperation that Buckner had established. He gave orders to Army divisions with the same matter-of-fact authority he gave to Marine divisions. He did not favor one service over the other. He did not use the moment to grandstand or to prove a point about Marine superiority. He simply commanded. The Army division commanders who served under him during those 5 days raised no objections and filed no complaints. The war went on. The chain of command functioned. The only people who had a problem with Roy Geiger commanding the 10th Army were the people who were not on Okinawa. By June 21st, organized resistance had collapsed across the island. In the early morning hours of June 22nd, in their command headquarters inside Hill 89 near the village of Mabuni, Lieutenant General Ushijima and his deputy, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide. After a final banquet with sake and the last of Cho's supply of captured Scotch whisky, the two generals made their way to a narrow ledge overlooking the Pacific. Ushijima wore his full dress uniform. Cho wore a white kimono. Ushijima insisted on going first. He cut deeply across his abdomen. An aide completed the act with a sword. Cho followed moments later. Before the end, Ushijima gave one final order that may matter more than anything else he did on Okinawa. Colonel Yahara, the architect of the entire defense, asked permission to die alongside his commanders. Ushijima refused. He told Yahara that if he died, there would be no one left who knew the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. He ordered Yahara to bear the temporary shame and to endure. Yahara obeyed. He was captured by the Americans in July. He survived the war. He wrote The Battle for Okinawa, the only first-hand account by a senior officer of the 32nd Army. Ushijima's last order preserved the truth of the battle for history. On the morning of June 22nd, Geiger raised the American flag over 10th Army headquarters in a formal ceremony, marking the end of organized resistance. The timing was deliberate. Geiger knew Stilwell was coming. He knew the Army wanted the final victory credited to an Army general. By declaring the island secure, and conducting the flag-raising ceremony before Stilwell arrived, Geiger ensured that the official record would show the historical fact. A Marine had commanded the 10th Army at the moment of victory. Stilwell arrived on Okinawa on June 23rd. He formally relieved Geiger of command that same day. Roy Geiger's command of a United States field army had lasted exactly 5 days. He returned to his Marine duties without public protest, without visible resentment, and without a single recorded complaint. He had done the job. The job was finished. The scale of what the 10th Army had endured is staggering, even when stated plainly. More than 49,000 American battle casualties, including over 12,000 killed or missing, and more than 36,000 wounded. Adding roughly 26,000 non-battle casualties from psychiatric breakdown and disease, the total approached 75,000. The Navy lost over 4,900 dead, exceeding its wounded, making Okinawa the bloodiest engagement in the history of the United States Navy, worse than Pearl Harbor. 36 ships were sunk and 368 damaged. An estimated 90,000 to 110,000 Japanese combatants were killed. Fewer than 8,000 surrendered. Okinawan civilian deaths may have reached 150,000, roughly a third of the island's pre-war population. The combined carnage weighed directly on the decision made 6 weeks later to use the atomic bomb against Japan rather than execute Operation Downfall. Okinawa was, in the most literal sense, the battle that ended the war by making the alternative unthinkable. After Stilwell assumed command, Geiger returned to the Pacific. In July of 1945, he was appointed Commanding General of Fleet, Marine Force Pacific, the highest operational Marine command in the theater. On September 2, 1945, he stood on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay as the Marine Corps' sole representative in the official surrender delegation. Around him stood MacArthur, Nimitz, Halsey, and the senior generals and admirals of every Allied nation. Geiger watched the signatures that ended the war, standing in a group of men who had spent as much energy fighting each other's institutions as they had fighting Japan. The ceremony that day was a portrait of Allied unity. The reality behind it was a portrait of institutional rivalry that would intensify the moment the last pen was put down. In the summer of 1946, Geiger observed Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. 2 bombs were detonated, one airburst and one underwater, to test the effects of nuclear weapons on naval vessels. Geiger watched the blasts from a considerable distance and was profoundly shaken, not for personal reasons but because of what the weapon meant for the future of amphibious warfare, the mission that justified the Marine Corps' existence. If a single bomb could destroy an entire invasion fleet, then massed amphibious landings of the kind the Marines had conducted from Guadalcanal to Okinawa were obsolete. And if the Marines' primary mission was obsolete, then the Army's argument for absorbing the Corps suddenly had real teeth. On August 21, 1946, he wrote a letter to Commandant Vandergrift, warning that the atomic bomb had fundamentally changed amphibious warfare. He wrote that a complete review of the concept of amphibious operations would have to be conducted. He said he could no longer visualize another landing such as was executed at Normandy or Okinawa. That letter helped launch the Marine Corps' development of vertical envelopment by helicopter, a doctrinal revolution that would justify the Corps' existence in the atomic age. It was the last great contribution Roy Geiger would make. In November of 1946, Geiger transferred to Headquarters Marine Corps. He entered Bethesda Naval Hospital shortly afterward. On January 23, 1947, Roy Stanley Geiger died of lung cancer. He was 2 days short of his 62nd birthday. Congress promoted him posthumously to 4-star general. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Buckner was promoted to full general by a special act of Congress in 1954 and buried in Frankfort, Kentucky, near his Confederate father. The reason Geiger's 5 days matter beyond the battlefield is that they occurred at the precise moment the Marine Corps was fighting for its survival. After the war, the Army pushed hard for unification of the armed services. To the Marines, the Army's classified planning documents read like a death warrant. Reduce the Marine Corps to a small ceremonial force resembling the British Royal Marines. Strip its aviation, eliminate its divisions, end its ability to conduct large-scale operations. One Marine colonel observed that the army plan embraced almost word for word the missions of the British Royal Marines, and the only thing left out was providing bands for the Navy. Marshall himself was heard wanting the corps kept very small. The Marines fought back with everything they had. On May 6, 1946, Commandant Vandergrift told the Senate Naval Affairs Committee that the proposed legislation would in all probability spell extinction for the Marine Corps. His testimony was deliberate, measured, and devastating. He laid out the Corps' combat record, campaign by campaign, island by island. He reminded the senators that Marines had fought and died in every major Pacific campaign, and that the men who had done the fighting had earned the right to have their service survive the peace. Behind the scenes, a group of officers who called themselves the Chowder Society waged a quiet, sophisticated lobbying campaign on Capitol Hill. The society included some of the sharpest minds in the Marine Corps. Merritt Edson, who had won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal for holding Bloody Ridge against a Japanese regiment with a handful of raiders, lent his combat credibility. Gerald Thomas, who had served as operations officer for the 1st Marine Division, provided strategic thinking. Merrill Twining brought organizational skill. And the youngest member, Victor Krulak, brought a genius for political warfare that would later make him one of the most influential Marines of the 20th century. Krulak personally drafted position papers, cultivated congressional allies, and placed the Army's classified unification proposals into the hands of sympathetic members of Congress who used them to publicly challenge the Army's plans. The Chowder Society understood something the Army did not. In a democracy, institutional survival is ultimately decided not by generals but by legislators, and legislators respond to the people who vote for them. The Marines had something the Army could never match. They had public support built on a combat reputation that no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could erase. They won. The National Security Act of 1947 protected the Marine Corps as a separate service within the Department of the Navy. The Douglas-Mansfield Act of 1952 locked in its force structure. The Marine Corps had saved itself by act of Congress. And here is where Geiger's 5 days carry a weight that extends far beyond Okinawa. At the very moment the Army was telling Congress that Marines were unfit for high command, a Marine aviator had just commanded the largest American field army in the Pacific, in its bloodiest battle, and brought it to victory. The fact that the Army rushed Stilwell across the ocean to end those 5 days tells you how clearly the Army understood the implications. After the fighting ended, before Geiger left Okinawa, local civilians presented him with a small temple bell. A gesture from a people who had lost a third of their population in a battle fought on their soil by armies that were not their own. Geiger kept the bell. His family kept it after he died. In 2021, the bell was returned to Okinawa. A small bronze bell, connecting a farming boy from Florida who could not learn to fly until someone gave him enough responsibility to try, to an island where the last great battle was decided by men whose names are mostly forgotten. Buckner is remembered, when remembered at all, for how he died. Geiger is barely remembered. 5 days is not enough to build a legacy in the memory of a service that did not want you there. But 5 days was enough to raise a flag, enough to prove that the walls between institutions are not built on competence, but on the fear that the man from the other side of the wall might be the right man for the job. Geiger was the 5th Marine aviator, the commander of the Cactus Air Force at 57, the man who led Marines and soldiers across Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Guam, Peleliu, and Okinawa. The only Marine ever to command a United States field army, and the man who died 14 months after the war, buried under 4 stars he received after he could no longer wear them. He deserved more than 5 days. And Buckner, who lies in Kentucky near his Confederate father, deserved to be remembered for the best decision he ever made. He chose the right man, not the right army man, not the right Marine. The right man. The system that could not tolerate that choice has spent 80 years making sure it will never be made again. If this story gave you something to think about, subscribe. There are more of these stories. Most are about men who did their jobs and went home and never said a word about what they had done. They deserve to be remembered, not for the branch written on their collar, but for the service they gave when it was their moment, in their piece of the line, without asking anyone's permission.